So we put the kids to bed. My wife and I are sitting around the kitchen table with my parents, and we're just having like a glass of wine, and they know that I'm working on the book, but like we're not talking about it. And then they just out of nowhere, my dad's like, "You know what the problem with Michelle Obama's book is?" And I was like, "What?" He's like, she talks too much about emotions. She doesn't stick to the facts, and that's going to be the problem with your book.
You're listening to the podcast Stories of the Vietnamese Boat People. Hi, I'm Tracey Nguyen Mang, and welcome back. A few weeks ago, I got to interview the author of the memoir Saigon in front of a live virtual audience. Saigon, spelled S-I-G-H, G-O-N-E, is a clever memoir about a young boy, a Vietnamese refugee, and his coming-of-age story in the small town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This book is the debut of the first-time author Phuc Tran, also known as Phuc Tran. I first discovered Phuc on my Instagram feed. What caught my attention was the beautiful gallery of tattoo artistry. Phuc was born in Saigon, Vietnam, and his family fled to America in 1975 when he was just a toddler. Saigon is a misfits memoir about great books, punk rock, and the fight to fit in. Phuc is an educator, a writer, and a tattoo artist. An unexpected combination, which I think makes his story unique, yet very relatable. Well, I'm so happy you're here, and I was super excited to have you just because it's funny because I follow your Instagram before I even read your book. Everything about you was so untraditional to what we think of when we read stories about Vietnamese diaspora. A lot of what's been published are historical fictions or memoirs of somebody actually living through the experiences of the Vietnam War and fleeing the war. But your book, while it touches on that, it's really about your upbringing and coming to age in America. So there's a lot of topics that you cover in the book, and it spans from like immigrant refugee experience to racism, bigotry, to identity and assimilation, to I think like just the complexities of the Vietnamese family and what it means to have gone through some of the things that you have as a family. And of course, it has some good old fashioned teenage drama. So there's
Right.
a lot to unpack.
Right. It's like, it's like the teenage refugee story as told by John Hughes, right?
So I think I'd love to start from the beginning, if that's okay. And, I'm going to read some things out loud in your book in moments of tonight. But one place that I want to start is very early on in your book. I think it's like page 17 or something. You start out with, first of all, I have it, so I'm just going to read it.
Yeah, please.
I don't want to mess it up.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
But you have a section on page 17 very early on that says, April 1975, Saigon. I remember none of this, but I know all of it. I know all of it because it is the family story. So I want to start there. If you wouldn't mind briefly sharing with us what happened that day.
Sure. So it's, and it's only one of two places where, in the course of the book, I was really careful to only relay stories that I could remember or that I was a participant in. And our escape from Saigon was not something that I remember because I was not even 2 yet. But it was definitely a story that my family told a lot. And, and there are definitely details that were very much like fixed, and like there's sort of like variations depending on who's telling the story, but basically my grandparents, my so my for the non-Viet people, my mother's parents worked for the U.S. Embassy, and so at the end of April in 1975 when the U.S. Embassy was pulling out. My grandparents were evacuated along with, I think they chose 12 family members that they could take with them. And so we were, my mother, my father, I was the only, I was the only grandchild. And my bako, so my great grandmother actually also came. She was like 80 something, I think. And so we, went to the airfield where we were waiting to get on a bus, which would then take us to the transport. And we were waiting in line, and then just waiting and waiting, and there's hundreds of people, and finally we have a chance to get on the bus, and we get on the bus, and and I'm crying like so much, right? Like so loudly. Again, I don't remember any of this. This is just what everybody says, that I was crying so much and probably just embarrassing my grandmother, but why? That she was like, all right, fine. Like, let's just get off the bus. This is so annoying. So my whole family gets back off the bus, and we let like the other 12 people in line behind us get on. And then as our bus, the one that we were supposed to be on, started pulling away, it was struck by, rocket fire, and it blew up, and everybody on the bus died. And then we were just like, ooh. And then we waited for the next bus and got on that one and got to the airfield. And then we were eventually transported across the Atlantic or Pacific to Fort Indian Town Gap, where it was only one of four places that Vietnamese people could go once you got to the U.S. So you go to, what was it, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, California, or was it in Florida? Is that no?
It was, yeah, there was only like 4 temporary refugee camps that they stood up to take in the influx of refugees at the time.
Yeah. So we ended up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so you ended up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And one of the few, if not the only, maybe Asian kid in that town.
Yeah, I mean, there were not a lot of Asian kids in my town. And in school, I was the only Asian kid, or never mind, just Vietnamese kid up until in my classes until like high school sometime, so definitely through middle school. And there were other like Vietnamese families that would sort of come and go.
First of all, I've never even heard of Carlisle. I had to look it up.
Yeah.
And I realized after I looked it up that even though it's spelled like Carlisle, it's pronounced Carlisle.
Yes. Yeah. Tricky. Very tricky.
And it is small, because I think they said something like in 2020 it was approximately 20,000 population.
Yeah.
So, in your book, it talks about some of the different types of experiences that you had to go through as a refugee and a Vietnamese person. And it kind of was very, there was a lot of variation. So there was moments where you talked about the kindness of your sponsors and the community and the food and clothing that they, come bring over and checking in on you. And then there were experiences about the Vietnam veterans. Whenever they saw you or your family, you were like a symbol of something.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, there were the children that, slanted their eyes when they saw you or called you names. And then the people that were threatened to even have your family in the community. So there was just such a wide range of emotions and experiences in the book. And so I wanted to just hear a little bit from you why you chose to cover all of those variations.
Oh yeah, it seemed disingenuous not to, like I think, especially in the national conversation, like I think it's, this like blanket term of like white people, like the man or whoever the oppressor is. Like I think it certainly eases the conversation, right? Like and it makes statements seem really dramatic, but at the same time, like I think it takes a lot of complexity out of a conversation or out of an argument, right? Which is why we end up at impasses like in the public discourse, right? Because we're making like blanket statements about like Democrats, Republicans, white people, Black people, Vietnamese people, and it's just like they're like groups of people are not a monolith. And we experience so many different sorts of people in our town. Like it didn't seem right. It seemed really like an injustice to be like, and all white people in Carlisle were this way, which we just know is not true, because the flip side is like not all Vietnamese people are a certain way either. And so I just wanted to sort of wrestle, successfully or not, with the complexity of everybody's story, and that they're all interconnected. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that because I think you're right. It's like it's not, people aren't a certain way because they belong in a category. Like there are so many variations and complexity. And I think that that's sort of what you addressed across the book. And, there are a lot of things in your book that I think if you removed the decade and the references to the music, the genre, the movies, a lot of what you experience are still happening today to communities and to children that don't feel like they have a sense of belonging in their communities because of either their skin color, their economic class, or whatever it might be. And so I'm curious, like, all over the news, there's a surge in just the violence and hate crime against Asian Americans. What I'd love to hear from you is how much of what you told in your story as a child experiencing this is still the same 30 plus years later, and how much of it has actually changed for Asian Americans.
Um, yeah, I mean, again, like I think like the big caveat here is I'm only speaking from my experience and my observation. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, it is like there are definitely parts of me that are like, oh my God, like this sucks. Like, are we literally still doing this like 30 years later, 35 years later? Um, I think that the upside is the allyship that I am seeing from, people who, you know, don't have an obvious sort of vested interest in, the health and well-being of like, the Viet community or Asian Americans. Like that allyship, like the public sort of declaration, right? That like, I'm against anti-Asian violence, or whatever, Black Lives Matter, and from white people, like that's really powerful for me. Like, and the fact that we can have like a public conversation about it, and that it's even part of any kind of a discourse. Like, I think for me, like what was really toxic and damaging was that I'm experiencing all these, or experienced all these things in the 80s, in my early childhood, that I didn't have a space to talk about, and so it felt a little bit like being gaslighted by like, like I couldn't talk about it with my friends. Like my parents are just like, shut the hell up, like you could be dead in a ditch, like for my parents, like their bar was so low. It was like, well, let's see, there was an exploding bus that we didn't get on, so lucky you, shut the hell up. Like everything else is gravy. You know what I mean? So I totally get it. But for a little kid, like you don't understand that. You're just like, these kids are beating me up at school, or like, people are being like a-holes, and they're like, whatever. And then at school, like you can't even talk about it because like you're the only Asian kid. So the fact that like we're having a conversation about it at all seems powerful to me. And like, name it, frame it, and then tame it. So I think is talking about it like the end all and be all. God, I hope not. Like I hope that leads to action, and then to, you know, popular reform or some sort of like policy, considerations. But I think talking about it certainly helps, at least from like an individual space. Like I think like I don't feel crazy and feel gaslighted, and then like I get to connect with people like you, and we're like, hey, like this is kind of crazy, right? Like, and that felt really lonely for me as like the only Viet kid. Like I could never go up to like another Viet kid and be like, hey, do your parents also like beat the crap out of you? And then like, like I just could never, I had no frame of reference for anything. So I was like, I guess everything is normal. Like this is just how life is.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that. And like, yeah, there's a lot of things that you share about your family that is personal, right? The complexity, your dad's temper. One part, first of all, I felt like you were telling my story. And it was the part about whenever you got punished, you had to kneel on your knees And I'm like, what the heck? Why did our parents do that to us? Because let me tell you, like, I think you described that you had to kneel on like uncooked rice grains.
Yeah.
Mine was your hands were out, and the bigger the crime, the more books you would get on your
Oh
hands while
man.
you're kneeling. And but those are moments where I agree with you, is that I felt it was normal. And it was just the way that they, taught their kids what was right or wrong. And it was a form of punishment. And we never talked about it. And then you're right, when you grow older and you say it out loud, you're like, holy cow, that sounds like it was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And part of it's probably the culture that we grew up in, though.
For sure. And I had this conversation with some you know Vietnamese Americans who lived out in California, and they were telling me that in the 80s, in the early 80s, on like Viet TV and radio, there were these PSAs were in Vietnamese, and it was basically like, hey, Viet parents, don't beat your kids because somebody will call DHS. Like, you can't do it like in the old country. And I was like, oh man, my parents would have really benefited from that PSA. Like we're just like in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and they're just like, going to town. Yeah, it's very, but I love that they're somewhere, like even in the 80s, there was this like consciousness, right, that like, oh, like we have to make some cultural adjustments now, because the context is different, right? The cultural norms are different. But yeah, it was totally cultural, and just because it's cultural doesn't mean that it's good or right, like,
Yeah.
so I think there's that also consideration. Like, I don't, like, I'm thankful that like you and I can have this conversation about like our upbringing and be like, yeah, sure, like corporal punishment was like super common in Viet culture, and like, is that the best thing for kids? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, at least all the studies, psychological and like child development things I've read, like, sort of don't encourage corporal punishment. But
Yeah. I
and
mean, there,
don't go ahead.
no, no, no. I was going to agree with you because there's so many things in our parents' upbringing. And actually, that brings me to another clip I want to read because this one also spoke to me. So I'm going to read a piece from your book, and this is around a part in your book where you got in some real trouble. I won't mention it because everybody's got to pick up the book if you haven't read it.
Okay, so you're not going to read the sex scene then either.
Oh yeah, there's some very sensual teenage descriptions in here too. But there's a part where you obviously were a bad teenager. You were grounded for a long time, and Christmas came around, and your parents, even though you were grounded for like 6 months, your parents surprised you with this amazing gift that they probably had to save up for a long time to afford. But the gift basically said without words that they get you, or they're paying attention to who you are.
Mm-hmm.
But in this moment, you aren't exchanging the words of gratitude that you're feeling inside. And so you write, we lost an opportunity to connect with a kind word with tenderness as father and son. Maybe we would have failed anyway, but I didn't even try. We didn't talk about how he felt or how I felt or where our relationship was. We never did. I had never heard my father say, I love you to me. And then you go on to say a few more things. And I think that touches a lot of our upbringing in Vietnamese families, probably even, broader to say Asian families. And, like even the Vietnamese word, there's no real word to say I love you to a child. There's like anh yêu em. But that's like you say it to your boyfriend or your husband. There's no real like, good night, honey, I love you, like there is in the English language. So a lot of us didn't grow up with those words of affirmation. And our parents were acts of service, which if anybody follows the 5 love languages.
So somebody like categorized like different ways that we
different ways that you show your love. And people, like words of affirmation are the ones that always say, I love you all the time. Acts of service is ones that can't say it, but they're always going to do what they feel is best for you or do something that makes you happy. And there's another love language that is gift giving, somebody who showers you with gifts. And it's so important because in order to connect in a relationship, you can't expect the other person to show love the way that you show love.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand how they show love, and you have to accept that. And I think what you described in your book in that passage is not being able at that moment to understand it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and I bring that up because I want to just ask you, like, there's so many parts in your book that is about those personal feelings. So first of all, have your parents read this?
They didn't for a long time. They didn't, and then maybe like 6 months after the book had come out, like we were on a text thread, and I finally like texted my parents. Like I wasn't gonna like I'm not gonna make anybody read the book, like especially my family. Like if they don't want to, read it, they certainly don't need to. Um, but I texted my parents, and I said, and I was like, hey, like just asking, like, have you guys read the book? And my dad literally like just texted back. He's like, yes, it was very painful, and like that was it. And like, yeah, I mean, my mother's like functionally illiterate, so in English, like I think that like the book is written in such a way that I'm not sure how much of it she would get anyway. But my father's a good reader, really
Yeah,
good
so I
reader.
was going to ask you,
Yeah.
like, when he read some of those moments where I'm sure he didn't really know that his son was feeling that way, if you guys had talked about it or had dialogue, or did it shape your relationship differently?
No, I don't think no. Is that totally unsatisfactory? I mean, I think I just think that there's like a threshold at which like he's comfortable talking about stuff. It's generational, it's cultural, like who knows. And I've tried for a long time to sort of like get him to communicate with me beyond what he's comfortable doing, and it's really hard. And like we also live very far away, so I think it's like really powerful for us to sit in a room and like talk together. Like it's hard on the phone or on Skype or Zoom or whatever. So I mean, this has been going back like 10, 15 years where like um we're just trying to talk, and it's hard. And ultimately I think it's like frustrating for me, and really like for me, like I think the breakthrough was like through my own counseling and therapy, and recognizing that like at some point like he is who he is, right? And I can choose to care about him and love him for that or not. And I think like once I sort of was like he is who he is, and I'm okay with that. And like if he ever wants to initiate a conversation or talk about stuff, like that's really great, but like I don't think I need his participation in my healing, right? Like to put it totally bluntly. Yeah.
So, what made you want to write a memoir? Like, tell me about, when did this start, and what was kind of going through your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't share my story for a long time, like really ever. I just thought like it was just too weird, and it never sounded like anybody else's story. And I think like growing up in the 80s and the 90s, like I think like I was really aware of like how everybody's story was like, oh my God, you went to summer camp, I went to summer camp, and da 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 da. And I'm just like, what's summer camp? So I just was like, you know what, I'm just gonna like keep my head down, keep my mouth shut, and just pretend like everything's hunky-dory. But then I think like as I got older, like in my 20s and 30s, like I just like that there was that part of me that like I just never shared with anybody. And I had the chance to give a TEDx talk. And I just thought, well, if this is like the most public thing that I'm ever going to do, like if this is like the biggest audience, of like 300 people in an auditorium, like I'm just going to go for it. Like, and I'd gone through therapy at that point, so like, so I'd done all this like sort of like personal work just for myself. And then this opportunity for the TEDx talk came up, and I just thought, like I need to be like as authentic and raw and real as possible. And if people get it, like if they don't get it, that's okay. Like that's not about me, that's about them. And in the TEDx talk, they kept using this refrain of like, this is the talk of your life, this is the talk of your life. And so I took that very literally. And so was like, okay, great. I'm going to talk about like being like a Vietnamese refugee, and I'm going to talk about like Carlisle, and I'm going to talk about like punk rock and grammar and Star Wars and like 80s pop culture, like what could possibly go wrong. I'm going to do it all in 12 minutes. And like the response was so powerful. And so that, just like that act of like sharing my story in a really public way, was like, oh, like that was really like, that really felt powerful for me and really therapeutic, in a strange way. And so I started doing like live storytelling here in Portland. Like I do like 1 or 2 events a year. And then in 2016, my agent came calling after she saw the TED Talk, and asked me if I wanted to write a memoir. So I'd already sort of like started priming the pump of just like the idea of, sharing my story publicly, right? Like not so subtle, wink, wink to the story slam. Like I think it was so validating, and energizing, and yeah, restorative to do that. Yeah.
So had you written other books before this?
No,
So what
no.
was the process like, and how long did it take you?
Oh God. I'm like I read a lot and I love reading, like, and I feel like there's a scene in High Fidelity, it's in the book and it's in the movie, and Rob Gordon, the main character, for those of you who don't know, he's like this like record store owner, and he talks about being a DJ and being in a band, and he talks about how he's like a professional appreciator, and he feels like he has to like contribute. So in some ways, like, I'd not written a damn thing, but I'd read a lot, and at some point you think like, okay, I think I can like string together a couple words and make like a pretty good sentence. Like I've read thousands of them, and I just need to do that over and over again. So um, the actual manuscript I think took me about a year to do. I was teaching, full time during the day and tattooing at night and the weekends. So I was really just writing like every other Sunday.
And you were teaching high school?
Yeah. So I was teaching high school Latin and then tattooing, and then I had like, my family, my poor family. Yeah. So like my wife was like basically like a book widow for like a year and a half.
Do you think because you were a high school teacher during the time, it helped you get into a mind of a teenager? Because the book really, like some of young folks' thought processes are like, they are kind of chaotic and scattered.
Yeah.
How you would imagine a teenager might operate.
No, that's really how I am in real life. I'm pretty. No, I mean, I think maybe the opposite is true. Like maybe like there's like some kind of weird arrested development for me. Like maybe I'm a high school teacher because like deep down, like I'm really just like still kind of like an
A big
adolescent.
kid at heart.
Yeah, I just like laugh at like poop jokes and stuff. Like they're hilarious, and like, farts are funny, and my daughters like think they're. I don't know. Like I mean, I have no idea. But I mean, kids these days are different. Like I think it helped me in some ways. I think in other ways, like even the contrasts. Like I taught at like a private school, but like it was a private school, and it's in Maine, and it's just, and it's 30 years later. So there were enough things that were different that like it wasn't like I was just like, oh, like kids these days are just like kids from the 80s or the 90s, but it didn't hurt, I guess. Yeah.
So what did your family say when you're like, hey, I'm going to write a story about us?
I don't think that they took it that seriously. Like I think I was just kind of like, I think, I don't know. Like I mean, I'm also not like I don't like bluster, like I was very low key. Like I was like super low key because I also like I'm not one of these people who like makes like a grand public declaration and then that's like the accountability piece. Like for me, like I'd rather be like super low key and then just be like, boom, like, oh, I did this thing. So that's really how I was. I was like, oh, I'm kind of like, maybe I might be working on a thing. I don't know, anyway. Next subject, like, how about the Knicks? Like they're terrible this year or whatever. So I was like, when I got the contract, like I might have told my brother, but I didn't tell my parents. And then when my parents really found out, or then my parents realized that it was like really a thing when like I would constantly be texting them. I sent them this like long ass like questionnaire of like just to fill in details for myself, like when things happen so I could get chronology right. I mean, I did as much research as I could in talking to them just to make sure that I had like sequences right, things like that. So that's when they really thought, and I think they were nervous So I have to tell this one other funny story. It's really, this is like classic my parents, right? So I'm in the middle of writing. It was like 2017 or 18 and 17, I think. My parents come to Maine to visit, and they're staying with us, and we put the girls to bed. And sorry, xin lỗi, ba má. So my we put the kids to bed. My wife and I are sitting around the kitchen table with my parents, and like, we're just having like a glass of wine, and they know that I'm working on the book, but like we're not talking about it. And then they just, out of nowhere, my dad's like, you know what the problem with Michelle Obama's book is? And I was like, what? He's like, she talks too much about emotions. She doesn't stick to the facts. And that's going to be the problem with your book. And I was like, damn, like, what? You haven't even read it. Like, I don't even, what? So like for like an hour, like, and my wife can like attest to this. Like they were just like hammering me, like just being like talking about all the things that like was going to be wrong in my book, and like how like I wasn't going to like, like the thing that they kept saying was like, you don't know half the story, like you don't know the real story. And I was like, well then tell me. And they're like, we can't. You would fall out of your chair. And I was like, well, okay, but you could tell me, like I've done therapy, like I'm fully, as healed as I'm gonna be, like lay it on me. But so they wouldn't. So they kept saying like, you're telling your story. It's only like this half story. You don't know all the facts. That's the problem with your book. Like, and it was like an hour of that. And then like after, and then my parents went to bed and my wife was like, what the hell was that? Like, what was going on? I was like, I don't know. It's fine. It was very strange. So that was like the only like in-person like sort of drama that happened.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, that's so funny.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it is a lot of emotions, but I think that's
Yeah.
what actually resonates with a lot of the readers, because it's like everything that they felt but couldn't connect when they were going through it. And I think reading it later as an adult, and in your words, it's like there's some sort of healing that comes with it, because you realize you're not alone. And you kind of always knew you were never alone, but then like to see that somebody publicly wrote about it, it just kind of brings validation. So tell us how you came up with the clever name for the book, Saigon, and chose this photo for the cover.
Yeah, so two separate conversations. I had very little input on the cover. It was actually like really like just the design team at Flatiron. Um, they they sent me this like questionnaire. It was like 3 pages long. Like, what do you want the book cover to look like? So like I wrote it all out. Like I like had made this like Pinterest board. I was like, this is what I think the cover should look like. And they're like, yeah. And then they gave me that cover, and I was like, oh, this looks not at all like the thing, but it's fine. So I can't, but like it just didn't. It looks so different from what I had sort of given them input about that it took me a long time. But I love it now. Like it's very funny. It's very much like this is about like a Vietnamese kid with like crazy teeth and like a bad 70s sweater. And yeah, so I can't really speak more to the creative process for making the cover, because they just did their thing anyway. The title, I mean obviously like it's a pun on the name of the city, Saigon. I wanted it to be evocative of something lost, right? And I think it's up to the reader, I think, to engage with this idea of like what's lost and like the wistfulness of the things that you lose in the process of assimilation and Americanization and coming here and leaving your country and all that stuff. I in a very real way, like I wanted to recreate the experience of someone having to spell something out every time they say it, which is like my experience every time I'm ordering food or anything. Like if I'm not using my Starbucks name, like I'm sure you have to spell out like your last name for people like all the time. And it was such a coup when like I think it was like Weekend Edition, like NPR, like Scott Simon like said Saigon, and then he had to pause and then he had to spell it out. And it's like that's my experience like every day, all the time. And also it's like this metaphor for you say the words like Saigon and it looks like one thing and it sounds like another thing, right? So it's hopefully operating on a couple of different levels.
Yeah, it's so clever. I love it.
Thanks. Not as good as me yet, but
Oh.
it's pretty good.
It's better. Speaking of though, like just sort of having to spell out and pronounce your name, like, a lot of us grew up eventually changing their names, myself included. And I remember reading your book where you tried to switch to Peter
Yep.
after Peter Parker, of course.
Yeah.
Made complete sense.
Yep.
And so I don't know, you tell the audience, like, in the end, why did you choose to keep your name?
Oh, I just didn't I just thought that if I had like the name Peter, it would just like, okay, like I'm just gonna fit in with everybody else, like they won't make fun of my name. And then I didn't know that like Peter was slang for a penis. So like the day that the day I changed my name to Peter for a day, like, and then the kids were all of a sudden like, suck my Peter. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I just didn't even know. And I was like, oh my God. So I just was like, okay, like if I'm just gonna be made fun of no matter what, it's clearly not like my my experiment was like, if I just change my name, everything will be fine. And I was like, no, it's you, it's not your name. So I just was like, it's fine. It was just too hard. What was interesting is that like I think as you like very like a lot of like Viet people know, like you have like an American name and then you have your like Viet name, and like my aunt has like my aunt is no, but like her American name is Michelle, and her husband is Jiang, but he goes by Paul, and it's like everybody's got like a spy agent name, like an undercover name, or a
Yeah,
superhero name, whatever.
totally.
Yeah.
The whole naming thing is so interesting because I think when we were growing up, it was common, it was never questioned. It was easier
Yeah.
to, basically like make it easier for people around us. But now, I mean, all the news about um, people like professors not respecting
Yeah.
someone's given name or culture name, it's absurd and it's ridiculous and it should be unacceptable in today's time.
Yeah, I mean, I saw this great performance, like pre-pandemic. It was like one of the last things that I saw, and it was a queer performer, and he was saying how we're constantly asking the LGBT community to bend towards straightness, like in the way that they live and in their life. And he did this thing where he made his audience sort of bend towards queerness, and it was really powerful. And I was like, oh, it's so true. And it's like, and I think in some ways, like that's a question that we can ask about like sort of dominant culture, which is a stand-in for white culture. And like we're constantly asking marginalized communities to bend towards whiteness. And so from time to time, like, why don't you bend towards us for just a little bit, like see how it feels. Like it's not going to kill you, like to say Wing or Phuc or whatever. Right,
I know we talked about how Asian Americans are treated and just sort of all the things that are happening to us that we have to be like, why is this happening still, 30 plus years later? But the other thing that I wanted to just get your perspective on is that, there are people in the Vietnamese community today that don't believe in opening up America for more refugees or immigrants. And for those that may not be as familiar with the Vietnamese diaspora history, I mean, the peak of it was between 75 and 82, where America was taking in hundreds and thousands of refugees, and people were opening doors and helping us. But for whatever reason, our community today, there are people that believe that we were a different type of refugee. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on what all that means.
Again, caveat,
Now,
I'm
no,
I'm
I'm kidding.
I'm just a tattooer. Yeah, I mean, I understand it. I don't agree with it at all. I think, um, like I think in Viet culture, like we're like, I like I'm gonna make some generalizations here, but I think like there's a fine attunement to hierarchy and authority and power, right? Like I think like within the family structure, right? Like like who hierarchically, like who is where the pecking order. um and I think that informs like their sense of like our larger culture. And so I think like at least in my limited experience with my family, like there's a strong alignment towards the power structure and preserving that power structure, aka whiteness and white supremacy, right? Like so I think that for some people, like I can't speak for anybody, but like my own experience in my family, I think, at least in my family, I think there's this idea that like we're going to align with whoever is in charge, because like we respect the power structure and hierarchy, right? Because
Mhm.
when you don't, you get civil war, and and like they've already come out of that. So I think like the conservatism that comes from at least my family, um, sort of emanates from that like sort of high, like being so highly sensitive to like power and authority. And um yeah, I don't know. What do you think? You think that's a lie?
I don't know what to think, to be honest. I mean, I have a lot of strong emotions, and a lot of it leans towards, I think it's hypocrisy.
Mm,
Um, I don't understand why we would think we are better
hmm.
or that we are more deserving as a
Right.
refugee group than others. So, a
Racism.
lot of my feelings lean toward that.
Yeah.
But when I say I don't know what to think about it, is because I think a lot of what shape someone's opinion is their upbringing and their background and their experiences. And so, I try to step away and make sense of all that, like why perhaps the older generation of Vietnamese people might think that way.
Yeah, and it seems like the break is generational, right? Like I think
Yes.
it's really like our parents' generation that has that kind of anti-immigrant sentiment.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it could be like good old racism too, right? Like they just look down on other people, and I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt too, but it's touchy. I know we avoid certain topics in our family because I think, no matter how old we are, our parents are always going to talk to us like we're children, I think. So it's very hard to win a
Yeah,
debate
yeah,
with
yeah,
them.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, or even just have a conversation, right? No, I
Yes.
still agree. But I think for me, like I come at it from a place of curiosity and just trying to understand um, why they feel the way they feel. Like I think it would be presumptuous of me to enter into any conversation with my family with the mindset that like I'm going to change somebody's mind. Like I don't think that's particularly productive. As opposed to just like listening, and if they say something kind of like questionable or that I don't agree with, like like I simply just say like, well, oh, why do you feel that way, right? And like they'll say things like, oh, well, those people are rapists and drug dealers or whatever, and I'm like, do you know any, like, tell me why you think that, and
Yeah.
at some point like you get to the root of it, and I don't know, maybe that helps them just in saying it aloud. Maybe they can hear it themselves, and
Hmm.
yeah, who knows.
I know, complicated stuff.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm just a tattooer who's had a triple Rob Roy. So, like really just a bunch of garbage coming out of my mouth right now.
so we're in season 4, and every season we have a theme. So this season, our theme is the search. And it can be a search for something physical or metaphorical. So I'd like to ask you, what was young Phuc searching for in his memoir, and has adult Phuc found it?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, for sure. Young Fook was definitely looking for his place in the world, and adult Fook has definitely found that. Yeah, for sure.
It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tracey. Thank you so much, and thanks for creating a platform for the Vietnamese diaspora to share their story. Yeah, no matter how unconventional they are.
If you haven't read the book yet, you can find it online at major book retailers and audiobook platforms. It's a perfect combination of trauma, classic literature, and comedy, with a raw and honest look at a Vietnamese boy's search for identity, connection, and finding his place in the world. To connect with Phuc directly, follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Vietnamese Boat People and search for details under episode 26. And a special shout out, Megan Doe for the event production and Matt Young for editing support on this episode. I'm Tracey Nguyen Mang, and thank you for helping us preserve history.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. And please take a moment to rate us and provide us feedback. And if you have a story to share, contact us at stories@vietnameseboatpeople.org.